Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 2 of Intro to Women and Gender Studies. This week, we're going to talk about the definition of oppression, of privilege, and to start talking about these larger system-oriented words that we'll be using throughout the course.
Okay, so oppression refers to the vast and deep injustices that some groups suffer as a consequence of assumptions that are often unconscious and reactions from often well-meaning people in ordinary interactions, media and cultural stereotypes, bureaucratic hierarchies, and market mechanisms. In short, the normal processes of everyday life. And this is from Marilyn Fry. And so this is talking about how we tend to, especially growing up, think of things like racism or sexism as only extremely overt, as somebody yelling a slur out of the window, as somebody committing violence against someone, but not necessarily in structures, not in who has more or less opportunity, not in who designed these things and who are they designed for. We don't necessarily think about stereotypes as being particularly pervasive. We often tend to think of ourselves as kind of post those stereotypes in a lot of ways. It just is very not the case. Because oppression is structural. So Fry said, rather than a result of a few people's choices or policies, its causes are embedded in unquestioned norms, habits, and symbols, in the assumptions underlying institutional rules, and collective consequences of following those rules. So what this is saying is that oppression is also in what we don't question, what we see as normal, what is considered standard in our societies as well. I wanted to highlight some of these pieces here that I thought was a little bit harder to read without being highlighted in this particular way. So the causes are embedded in unquestioned norms, habits, and symbols. These are things we don't think about, things that aren't talked about, ways that society is just set up. An example of this would be in terms of unquestioned norms and habits, people kind of like race segregating on their own in an educational environment or in a workplace. And for different reasons, right? White people feel more comfortable with white people. People of color tend to feel more comfortable around people of color because they are in a space where they're less likely to be harmed by white people. White people tend to want to isolate because they have racism that they haven't addressed that is causing them to feel distance from those groups. Another unquestioned norm would be just like having men's and women's bathrooms, and what that means for so many people who don't conventionally fit into those boxes. And then it lies in the assumptions that are underlying institutional rules. And this is talking about a similar idea, but that who are we thinking about and who are we not thinking about as we build up the court system, the way that police respond, how education systems are set up, and so forth.
So some basic concepts that I want to outline before we get started. So for every oppressed group, there's a group that is privileged in relation to that group. So these dynamics don't exist without each other, that we have white people who experience privilege and people of color who experience oppression when we talk about oppression based on race. We have sexism where the privileged group is men and the oppressed group is everyone who is not men / women. There's always going to be this dynamic of having a group that experiences privilege at the expense of a group who experiences oppression. Having a privileged identity does not mean that you don't also hold oppressed identities. And so you can be somebody who experiences privilege for being white, experiences privilege for being male, but experiences oppression based on socioeconomic status or class, or disability, or queerness. You can be a person who experiences privilege in terms of sexual orientation, in terms of ability, but who experiences racism or sexism. And this can make it complicated when folks are looking at their own experiences and trying to figure out where they experience privilege, where they experience oppression. We are so rarely taught to acknowledge the places where we receive privilege, but rather to focus on the places where we experience oppression. And those are important. We're spending a whole week talking about them, so they're obviously important. But sometimes that comes at the expense of us understanding the ways that we are also experiencing privilege in the same situation or in other situations. And having a privileged identity doesn't mean that you don't experience challenges. It just means that you likely are not experiencing challenges because of that identity in a systematic way, as somebody who has an oppressed identity in that sphere would be more likely to experience. And so an example of this that comes up often is white people who are in predominantly POC spaces and feeling like, well, I'm oppressed in this situation because I feel like I don't fit in, or I'm being made fun of, or I'm being singled out, or they don't like me because I'm white. And that is not experiencing oppression. That can be experiencing it's what I'm looking for. Could be experiencing like individual prejudices. You can be experiencing the results of larger privilege. You can be experiencing discomfort. You can be experiencing a challenge. But when you leave that building, and even in that building, when it comes to who's getting promotions, who's getting paid what, who's seen as an authority, when you leave the building and get pulled over or are walking down the street alone, your privilege as a white person going to impact what the rest of your life looks like. You are not experiencing racial oppression in that moment, while you could be experiencing racial discomfort in that moment. And I think there's a part of us, right, that like cringe a little bit. We think about like racial discomfort. We're just like, no, I don't feel that. But like you probably do. And that's fine, that's normal. That is a impact of racism in our society, not quote unquote like reverse racism. It's just a slightly more complicated expression of the impact of racism on our larger structures. So we'll dive into all of that as we go throughout the course. Privileged identities are generally society's defaults, which shape how we structure the world. So these are things that we tend to assume everybody is or should be. So for example, we have like a big and tall section of a clothing store, and the larger section of the clothing store is what we call straight sizes, non-plus size options, or the non-big and tall options. We default to assuming that everyone is men and women. And so the default is to just have men's and women's public bathrooms and to not be thinking about the needs of non-binary people or gender non-conforming people in those spaces. The default is for folks to work a 9-to-5 work day. That requires you to have specific kinds of transportation that doesn't work really well for people like myself who have ADHD. It is generally assumed that if you are signing up for a service, they can call you. But maybe you don't, you need a special service to use the phone because you can't hear. Or that it's assumed that you have a smartphone, that you have a QR code and you can scan that, but you can't afford a smartphone. Privilege tends to show up as defaults, and when you experience oppression, it tends to feel like your life is in contrast with how the world is set up. Your privileged and oppressed identities intersect to create your own unique experience. And so, for example, I navigate the world basically as a white dude. White privilege comes in. I experience many elements of male privilege in at least some spheres. And I'm a trans person. I have visible chest scars. I don't feel safe going to the beach in most places shirtless, in case people notice those. I use a stall every time I go to the bathroom. Most men's bathrooms only have one stall in them, and so I'm often waiting for that. And there's often not a neutral option. I get flagged every single time I go through the TSA line. And at the end of the day, they look at me and they see a white dude, I get relatively well respected in those situations. If I was a Black trans woman going through TSA, the likelihood of me experiencing violence in that scenario is much higher. Being pulled and not being able to make my flight, them messing with me, them harming me is all much, much higher than when they see white dude body, experience the confusion of transness, figure out what's going on with the transness, and then move on. My whiteness and my dudeliness are very protective factors in those scenarios.
Now, you may or may not have heard of misogynoir, a fairly new term for an age-old experience that most Black women know all too well. We've brought in an incredible panel of women to discuss it today. Our beauty expert, Tracy Peart, our pop culture expert, Kathleen Newman-Bermang, and journalist and author, Eternity Martis, who you'll recognize as the writer of one of our Cityline Book Club picks. They said this would be fun. So let's begin by defining misogynoir. And Eternity, I'm going to ask you to do that for us.
Misogynoir was a term that was coined by Moya Bailey. And so she's a U.S. Feminist scholar, Black woman. And it really encompasses what it means to be Black and a Black woman and deal with racism and sexism. So it's almost like the double discrimination of being Black and being a woman. And what misogynoir really touches on, it's that particular dislike, hatred, prejudice, and bias against Black women.
Yeah, it's almost like there is an attraction and a repulsion, and it's that intersection, as you said, Eternity, between sexism and racism, and it's something that, you know, Black women are in this very unique category of experiencing this. So I want to talk about how misogynoir actually plays out in real life. And I'll start with you, Kathleen. If you have an example of what you've seen of misogynoir that might help our viewers understand the concept.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many examples. I think one of the ways that people understand it is how we've seen it in pop culture. R. Kelly wouldn't have a career if it wasn't for misogynoir. He built this career while he was abusing Black girls, and people did not care because of that intersection between racism and sexism, where Black women are repeatedly disrespected. I think we saw it with the U.S. election and how people reacted to Kamala Harris. I think we see it with Serena Williams. I think there are so many examples. We see it in pop culture every day. I think in my life, how I have seen it is in, little comments that people will say, even Black men, because I think one of the big things with misogynoir is how the patriarchy is such a big component of it. And so I've heard people say, I don't date Black women, or you're pretty for a Black girl. These sexist comments that are also so rooted in racism.
Absolutely. Tracy P., we've talked about this ad nauseum. Do you have some examples to throw out for us as well?
Exactly what you said. There's like this attraction and also this rejection. So we're celebrated for being very strong women, but at the same time, when we speak, we're considered loud, we're considered opinionated, we're considered aggressive. People want us to turn it down and dial it down when we're speaking our opinion. I've experienced that my entire life, and not only me, but a lot of Black women I know. When we speak, we're considered aggressive, but when our white counterparts speak, everybody's all ears, everybody's listening, everybody's attentive. Same thing, we're very much critiqued in a different way. I'm spoken to in a way with like I have no feelings sometimes. It's almost like we're supposed to be able to just take hits and just take bullets constantly, and almost like we don't feel it. And like it's very similar to what you just said about men saying that black men saying they don't want to date us. We're too aggressive. We're almost treated like masculine, but then at the same time we're over sexualized in music videos and in film and in media in general.
Yeah, well, when you talk about the masculinity, I remember a comment I got from a person out in the ether saying that I should not be wearing sleeveless tops because science proves that black women present as more masculine than white women, and therefore he finds this very unattractive, and I should cover up my arms. It's like, dude, that is the perfect intersection there of the sexism and the racism. And yeah, it's just, you can't run away from that. So I want to talk about where this comes from. And Eternity, you've got so many great examples in your book, but where historically, what feeds into this misogynoir that we see now?
We have to talk about history, right? We're not going to know any of this stuff if we don't talk about where it came from. And so these stereotypes that we see, the Jezebel, the freak, the welfare queen, these are all rooted in the past. But during slavery, black women were never seen as rapeable. So black women were presumed to have these bodies and the sexuality that tempted men. And so if you raped a black woman, you actually wouldn't go to jail, or you wouldn't even be convicted or charged. And so first of all, that part of this conversation of black women's bodies and black women being not valued and their sexuality being tempting comes from slavery, and it gave men permission to rape black women without any fear of being criminalized. So that's one part of the conversation. The other part is that Black women have always been seen as just parts, right? When we look at the example of Starkey Bartman, also very disrespectfully known as a Hottentot Venus, and her body, she was taken from her home and taken to the UK, where her body was put on display, and her butt was the kind of the show, right? People paid to go see that, and they would throw things at her, and she was whipped on stage. And so a lot of this hypersexuality stems from many decades ago, many centuries ago, of Black women always being seen as hypersexual and always wanting sex. And on the other hand, this idea of us being basically unbreakable or emotionally or physically unbreakable comes again from the auction block, where we have this, we even have this in Canada, classifieds of describing Black women's strength. And so it's always been seen that we're able to withstand all kinds of emotional and physical labor because of slavery and because of what we had gone through.
So one thing I want to say is the real life manifestation of this idea of us being able to take more pain is actually Black women getting less pain medication in hospitals and being treated not as well as our counterparts in the healthcare system. And we hear this about Black maternal rates in Canada and the United States. So there are real life issues that are affected by this idea. Now, I want to talk just about this idea of naming. Misogynoir, the name came out, as you mentioned, Eternity, by feminist Moya Bailey in 2008. But what do you think is the impact of giving a name to this? Kathleen, I'm going to ask you this one.
Well, you can't fix what you don't name. And nothing has gone away by ignoring it. And I think that putting specificity to what we are going through and history to it, like Eternity just went through, and the specific pain that we go through because of misogynoir, like Tracy spoke about, I think that is then how you fix it and how we move forward. Because ignoring it, like you said, it is life and death at this point. The stakes are too high. We are past being the only ones as Black women speaking about this and having to be that strong stereotype where we are going through this world with these very unique traumatic experiences and being the only ones who are pulling up for ourselves. So I think taking that language and applying it to what we are going through is how we move forward.
You all kept it so real, and this is clearly just the tip of the iceberg. Please keep this conversation going. Thank you so much to Eternity and Kathleen and Tracy P. for joining us to have this really important conversation.
I want to point out a few interesting and important things that were said here. One is talking about the importance of naming the thing, and we're going to talk a lot this semester about the importance of language and how language has shifted over time, and why that happens, and also the importance of being open to new language and understanding why we latch on to new words to describe older experiences. She also talked about having these conversations as part of consciousness raising, which is what we're going to talk about next week, which is helping folks to better understand their own experiences and the experiences of others through sharing those experiences, which is so much of what women and gender studies is rooted in, is that sort of practice. For folks in this class who are not Black women, I would really encourage you to think through this video and think about the ways in which this experience of sexism, whether as a witness or as a recipient, differs from what you've seen for yourself or for other people. You know, the piece about being seen as being able to withstand any sort of pain, I think is really interesting. And you know, relative to, say, white women, who I think are often perceived as highly sensitive, that they can't really handle much of anything and are helpless. And that's also sexism, which appears really differently, right? And so this was a good example to get us started
Now, you may
in
or
that
may
sort of
not
thinking.
have heard of misogynoir.
So some of the systems of oppression that we'll talk about this semester and that exist are racism, where white people experience privilege and people of color experience oppression in various ways. Sexism, where people who are privileged are men, and people who are oppressed are women and non-binary people. And with a lot of these, you may have some asterisks that pop into your mind. Some questions you may have, and those sorts of questions are really welcome. They're the sorts of things that we want to be exploring here together. And an example here is you might wonder, how do trans men, people like myself, benefit from sexism like other men do, like cisgender men do? And in what ways are we still harmed by sexism? How does that change with how the perception of us in the world changes and all of that? Heterosexism, which we often hear the word homophobia, which talks about having negative attitudes towards queer people, but heterosexism is the oppression version word for that. The system of expecting everybody to be heterosexual, that's heterosexism. And the same thing with cissexism. So that is the oppression word for what we often call transphobia, where trans and non-binary people experience oppression, and cisgender people, the word for people who are not trans, experience privilege in this particular way. And we'll dive into each of these with whole units, as well as in each of these units as we talk about intersectional identities. Ageism is an interesting one because who is discriminated against can depend on context. So there are situations in which younger people are disadvantaged. There are a lot of situations in which older people are disadvantaged. And it's hard to identify, you know, this is where does this stop and end in terms of who experiences privilege here? It's definitely situational. Another system of oppression is the way folks are categorized in immigration systems. People with legally recognized citizenship experience privilege, and people who are considered undocumented experience oppression. Ableism, so people who currently do not have a disability. This is framed this way in part because most people at some point in their lives will have a disability, whether permanently or temporarily. And people that are oppressed are disabled people, and I apologize for the typos on here. Sizeism is another interesting one where there's some room for debate as to specific individuals and what they experience, and I think this is certainly can come on a spectrum. And this is also an interesting one in that with many of these, you know, you can sum up most or all people into one of these two groups. And with the sizeism, this saying thin people and fat people doesn't necessarily represent everyone. That there are situations in which, so I almost wrote like thin people and people of like an average size, but average didn't really feel like the best way to frame that. And I didn't want to get too deep in the weeds here either. Essentially, people who experience privilege around sizism are people who don't have to go out of their way to find clothes that are going to fit their bodies, who see themselves represented in advertisements, whose weight or size isn't the first thing that's blamed for any medical or psychological problem that they're having, who can fit into cars and planes, desks in schools and in offices without special accommodation, and the people who cannot do some or all of those things consistently would experience oppression based on sizism. The idea is that the world is built for people of certain sizes. Some folks will separate out heightism as a separate system here. The idea that little people experience a unique oppression, as well as people who are extremely tall can experience some disadvantages as well. That's an interesting one that we can certainly dive into if folks are interested. Religion's another one where context definitely matters, and in this particular case, the country that you are in tends to be particularly important. In the United States, Christians experience privilege. The calendar for school and work is set around Christian holidays. It is typically assumed that people are Christian or come from a Christian background. And the people who are oppressed in the United States are all people who are not Christians. This includes people of all other religious and faith traditions, as well as, somewhat controversially, atheists, agnostics, and other non-religious people, in that they're often seen as bad people for not being religious, but often for specifically not being Christians. And then we also have classism. So people who benefit from classism in particular are rich people. But some other folks who don't typically experience classism are people who are comfortably middle class, with poor and working class people being oppressed in this situation. So Marilyn Frye describes the 5 faces of oppression, and these demonstrate how these systems function in our societies. And they give us language to describe the pervasive ways these systems of oppression impact our lived experiences. And they can help us answer questions such as, how does oppression manifest in everyday life, and how do systems work to knock down or keep down oppressed people? And these are her 5 faces. We have, and we'll go through each of these. We have exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and violence. And I really like this concept in that it takes a lot of words that I think often get used very interchangeably, or are used in ways that are not necessarily well defined or consistent. And this gives us a way of not only kind of giving us a checklist for understanding whether or not a group is oppressed, but also in helping us to kind of put that language that we hear all the time into its own place, to be able to say, okay, marginalization is part of oppression. Exploitation is part of oppression, versus, and I actually do this too, I tend to default to marginalization as kind of the overarching word, whereas Frye's argument is that oppression is the overarching word that we would use in a lot of cases here. So I do want to kind of preface this by saying I don't want people to put themselves in intense psychological harm for this. But as I mentioned, most, if not all, the folks in this class have at least one oppressed identity. So as you're going through these 5 phases, to the extent that you are psychologically safe to do so, I would encourage you to think about one of the oppressed identities that you hold, and try to see if you can identify some of the ways that people with that identity experience each of these phases. The first one is exploitation. It's the idea that people, I have a quote here that isn't a quote of a specific person, but they're kind of quotes that I think sum up what you might hear someone say as they're engaging in this particular phase, or what we how we might describe what this space means in reality. So this is the idea that you have to work twice as hard to get half as far. This is putting oppressed communities at an increased demand for their labor with lower compensation than people in the privileged group. And this is with compensation literally in terms of being paid less, but also socially in terms of how much does your work mean in terms of your reputation. How seriously are you taken, and how much power do you have in those workplaces? Some examples of this are the ways that oppressed people are constantly asked to educate us about their oppression. So that is free labor that we are expected to do for people who have privilege in that area. Classically underpaying and overworking laborers. This is where labor unions are really important. But also, as we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks, where we see a lot of race gaps and gender gaps as it relates to expectations around labor, as well as the pay that comes with it. Second one is marginalization. So this is the idea that you can be who you are, just not around us. So marginalization literally is defined as casting out those seen as less valuable and casting them out to the margins of society. So this can include segregating people both literally and psychologically, meaning like in our communities and who we care about more, who we place more value in. But segregating people so that the oppressed group has fewer resources and little to no access to the resources of the privileged group. So if you think about, this is a very basic example, but driving through a lower income city, and then all of a sudden when you cross the border into a richer area and the roads get a lot better, that's just an example of a marginalized community not getting what they need, and being, in often cases, literally pushed out of the community that had more resources. So examples of marginalization. So what I hear a lot in my life and in my work is when we talk about trans people in sports and us having equitable access to sports, I often hear the response of, oh, well, like, it's still not fair. Trans people should have their own thing, right? Rather than trans people should have access to the same spotlight that cis people do on the Olympic stage, on, in the World Gymnastics Championship, whatever it is, that no, you all should go have your own thing, as if magically that's going to be as well funded, as if magically that's going to get picked up by television, and as if that automatically would mean that the situation and the impact is the same for those athletes, that coaches would be willing to be there, fans would be willing to be there, all that stuff, and that who the fans would be of that are people who are also less likely to have the means to travel and to go to these what would be more niche sporting events. Another example is lack of accurate and comprehensive representation of identity in media. So seeing most of the time when we see Black women on TV, they're in very stereotypical ways. We see a lot of tropes when, and another aspect of this is your identity always being part of the storyline. So there are very few examples even now of trans people in media where our transness is not a huge part of the storyline. And we obviously want our authentic stories told, but we also don't always only want to be there for a teaching moment. And it's this idea of like, this is this really exotic othered thing that we're going to visit, and then we're going to go back to ignoring. Another example is having your fundamental rights up for debate while others' rights are considered untouchable. So this includes right to abortion. This includes the right to marriage, right to adoption, to travel freely. These are things that for groups who are oppressed, these things are up for literal debate. We're not having a debate whether straight people should be allowed to get married. We're not really putting forth legislation about should men have to undergo certain testing before they can be fathers. And that's the piece that Fry talked about earlier in saying that these are unquestioned norms, right? That privilege isn't necessarily always something that feels like a gift or like an advantage. It can also be not noticing others or experience a disadvantage. The lack of disadvantage is often how privilege feels or how it shows up. So the third is powerlessness, and the idea of this is we know best for everyone idea that not oppressed people not having a say in what is happening to them and around them, keeping people out of power and building structures to allow privileged people to help each other obtain more power. So if you think of the idea of like a boys club, country clubs literally exist essentially for this reason, helping well-connected people connect to each other. And people who are oppressed are generally expected to form their own systems for this rather than being invited into systems of power that already exist. So some examples are teachers were historically women, while principals were historically men. And in many businesses, you'll see all of the managers are white and all of the laborers are people of color. Cultural imperialism, the idea behind this is we're doing what's just for the majority. So another quote from Fry, to experience cultural imperialism means to experience how the dominant meanings of a society render the particular perspective of one's own group invisible at the same time as they stereotype one's group and market as other. So we've talked about this throughout, but the idea of cultures that focus on oppressed people being very niche, that things that the dominant group, the privileged group are doing are what's normal or what is default. The default in the US is that people celebrate Christmas, and it's surprising to people when someone doesn't. It is assumed that people are cisgender, and it is a surprise when people are not. Cultural imperialism and colonialism are also really linked in really interesting ways, saying our culture is better and should be the one that we default to. And what's interesting about this in the US is that it is actually in some ways difficult to identify what is like American culture. We have this whole idea like melting pot salad bowl that we're all a bunch of different things. And yet it totally is a thing. It totally is a thing. There are totally these norms. And part of the result of colonization and the slave trade and mass immigration have led to kind of like constant infighting in this country around essentially attempts to establish cultural dominance that have not always gone as successfully as the people who wanted those things wanted them to go. So examples, so school breaks are arranged on Christian colonialist holidays. I mentioned colonialist in that I'm including Thanksgiving here. Something I find really interesting as someone who's interested a lot in media studies is that we tend to very specifically look down upon the interests of teenage girls. That we see the interests of women in ways that still kind of aim to shame the interests of younger women, kind of pit women against each other in that particular way. We tend to see the interests of teenage girls as very frivolous, and to really kind of push them into the margins, into a negative space. And this cultural imperialism that we're trying to dampen their enthusiasm and to encourage a culture that is rooted in other things, in attention to men, in supporting nuclear families, that that when girls really, really like something, we tend to see that as a bad thing. Another example is that nude as a clothing item, as a band-aid, is a color that we can kind of picture, and it's not nude. Like, that is white people's skin color, generally speaking. And the last one is violence. So the idea that you don't deserve to exist or experience anything good. So this was a little more straightforward: unprovoked attacks on a person or property aimed to damage, humiliate, or destroy a person. Some examples that we see are Black trans women are very often murdered in the US and around the world. There's been at least 2 murdered in Detroit this year alone. 90% of rape victims are women, and 1 in 3 women globally will experience sexual or partner violence in their lifetimes. Another example is gentrification resulting in mass homelessness. Violence does not always mean one specific violent act. It can also mean putting people's lives and wellness in jeopardy in slightly more nuanced ways.
This all ties right back to the Peggy McIntosh reading you had this week, The Invisible Knapsack, where McIntosh lists many ways in which white people experience privilege. She compares white privilege to having a knapsack or backpack full of items that might help you navigate situations more easily, that signals to others that you're deserving of help through no virtue of your own. In unpacking this invisible knapsack of white privilege, I have listed conditions of daily experience which I once took for granted, she says. She says, my skin color was an asset for any move I was educated to want to make. I could think of myself as belonging in major ways and of making social systems work for me. I could freely disparage, fear, neglect, or be oblivious to anything outside of the dominant cultural forms. Being of the main culture, I could also criticize it, being the main culture, fairly freely. It seems to me that obliviousness about white advantage, like obliviousness about male advantage, is kept strongly enculturated in the United States so as to maintain the myth of meritocracy, the myth that all democratic choice is equally available to all, right? So this is a thing that we hear about the United States, that this is where the American dream can happen, where everybody's equal and where if you work hard, you're going to get what you deserve. And that is true for white men, and not necessarily true in the same ways for everyone else. So circling back to sexism in particular. So let's apply this structural approach to sexism. So what are the systemic daily life male privilege things that we see that inform what the experience of sexism is, right? So we talked about you have to have a privileged group to have an oppressed group. So this is where that structure comes in. So men are taken more seriously and are more likely to be seen as knowledgeable and as experts, as somebody who was not perceived as a woman in the world for 20 years and then suddenly, or who wasn't perceived as a man for 20 years and then suddenly was. This is true. The way that people just kind of like relative to in my previous experiences, taking what I say at face value, believing me, seeing me as a source of authority, giving me space to speak, that has increased drastically since the perception of my gender has changed and as I've transitioned. In hiring, it's assumed that women under 40 will need more time off for parenting, leading to discrimination. So there's a lot of assumptions that come into play here, right? That women, and I'm going to use very like binary terms for just a moment, because that's how the structure thinks of these things, that women should be mothers, that at some point they will be, that they're going to need maternity leave, that is a negative for the business relative to hiring a man, that woman's going to be distracted by family. Yet we don't have that same feeling around dads, right? Like as somebody who's not currently a dad, who's planning to be a dad, I think about all the ways in which like being a dad is going to change my life if I am doing it well. But the expectation is not that I be the child rearing parent. The expectation is that I be the working parent. The structure of sexism would favor me over my fiance in terms of who to hire, because sometimes that she'll be a person who takes time off for a baby more so than I would. Even though in reality, I think our plan is ideally to take the same amount of time off. And conversely, ways sexism impacts everyone. It's also in a lot of ways, a lot of places, assumed, legislated, rule-oriented that I couldn't take as much maternity leave as her. That she can't take nearly as much as she should, or that she could in other countries. That I don't have parental leave in the same ways that other people do in other countries. The assumption that she is the one who would be giving birth is interesting. At some point in my life, that was a thing I was capable of doing. How does that look for queer couples, etc. Right? So we're just digging deeper into how all these things interconnect. Older women, so I mean over 40 in this case, are assumed to lack professional experiences, and their lived experience isn't valued as knowledge. So the assumption is that women were spending time raising families and not on their careers, and therefore are going to have less on their resume than a man would. But that also, if that is true, that the experiences they had when they were not in a formal work environment wouldn't be valuable to the work environment. And that's crap. The organization that comes with managing a household, the like literal skills of cleaning, managing your emotions, time management, working with other parents and teachers and doctors, and all those interpersonal skills, things that we expect moms to be really good at, are also really valuable in the workplace. And the fact that we don't think about them that way is a product of sexism. Women and trans people are expected to handle sexism and transphobia in cis male dominated professions. So the idea is like, if you're a woman, you're going into engineering, it's just like, well, you're gonna have to deal with all this stuff. That's true. It shouldn't be the case. It was like, that's just the way it is. No, it shouldn't be that way. Men don't have to be misogynistic when they're around each other. That's a choice. And then we place even less social value on women with multiple marginalized identities. So if you are seen as somebody who understands somebody who isn't going to parent, there's a stigma attached there. If you are parenting differently from how people expect, your trajectory in life just differs from what people expected in literally any way. If you are experiencing misogynoir, if you are trying to navigate having a disability and being a woman, we place even less value as a society on those individuals relative to other women.
Okay, so if you go down to the video description on YouTube, or if you are in my class, this will be in your Moodle, there are 2 videos that if this is an in-person class, I would show you in class and we would talk about, that I'm going to have you watch from here. One is a TED Talk called The Credibility Gap, and then the second is a short video from the Trans Oral History Project, with a trans man talking about his perspective on sexism and how the ways he benefits versus the ways that he experiences sexism are, for lack of a better word, truly complicated. And so those will be how you conclude this week's video presentation, is go take a look at those 2 videos on YouTube. The trans man one is about 5 minutes and the credibility gap is 20 minutes. So you have about 25 minutes left of video watching for this course this week. Be sure to utilize those videos and your assigned readings in your reflection. Have a good rest of your week.